Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, and welcome to today's virtual Commonwealth Club event. I'm Garrett Hongo, poet, writer, and your moderator for today. The club's Asia Pacific Affairs member-led forum is proud to be hosting today's event. For more information about upcoming member-led forum activities and events, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org/member-led-forums. The club would also like to thank the Bernard Osher Foundation for supporting today's Good Lit event. It's my pleasure to introduce Bruce Henderson. Bruce is an award-winning journalist and author of more than 20 nonfiction books. His latest book, Bridge to the Sun, The Secret Role of the Japanese Americans Who Fought in the Pacific in World War II, is one of the last great untold stories of that war. Bruce chronicles the saga of Japanese Americans who are U.S. soldiers who fought in the Pacific against Japan, their ancestral homeland, even as their families back home in America were being rounded up and forced to live in government internment camps. We encourage you to submit any questions for Bruce in the YouTube text chat. Bruce, let me welcome you and start off by asking a question. What was it that brought you to the story of the Japanese Americans who served in the Pacific during World War II?
Well, thank you, Garrett. It's good to be here with you. I must admit, I came across the story rather accidentally. I was at the archives and I was researching another book of mine. And I discovered that there were these Japanese American soldiers who were trained as interpreters, translators, and interrogators, and sent into the Pacific. And now I had done World War II books, several of them, including a couple set in the Pacific, and I just had no idea that the Nisei soldiers fought in the Pacific. I knew about the 442nd that fought in Europe, in Italy, and France, and a highly decorated small unit that was said to be the most highly decorated unit of the war in Europe. A lot of books, a lot of films about them, but nothing that I knew about in terms of the military intelligence service training the Nisei for the Pacific. And I thought, what an amazing story that must be. And that actually started me on a 4-year journey to write this book.
Tell us about the climate in the U.S. towards Japanese Americans after Pearl Harbor, and then the removal, the internment that Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered in Executive Order 9066.
Well, as you know, even before Pearl Harbor, there was a lot of anti-Asian policies and prejudice. The immigrants, the Japanese immigrants, the parents of the Nisei, the men who would be the soldiers fighting in the Pacific, were still Japanese citizens. And in fact, they were not allowed to become naturalized American citizens. And in most cases, they were not allowed to own the land that they were farming. And there were just a lot of restrictions against them and a lot of prejudice against them. And then when Pearl Harbor happened and Japan struck our fleet in Hawaii, and we were in a war with Japan, now suddenly not only the Japanese immigrants, the parents, were considered alien, enemy aliens, but even their offspring, the Nisei, who were as American as anybody else, being born here and natural born American citizens, well, they were, if they lived on the West Coast, most of them were rounded up with their families and sent to these camps in these desolate areas of the country. And what's shocking is that of the 110 or 20,000 of these ethnic Japanese who were in these camps, 60% of them were American citizens. And they were there, completely deprived of their whatever rights any American has under, the Constitution. They were there. They were behind barbed wire.
So there was a strong suspicion of disloyalty and fifth column activity, possibly.
On the West Coast and with all the military installations, and there was that fear. And ironically, the young Japanese Americans, and it was not uncommon in those days for their parents to send, particularly their sons, to Japan for a couple of years to go to school there, to meet the relatives, to learn about the ancestors, the culture, the history of the ancestral homeland, and then, of course, return. But they were called the Kibe. And initially, when war broke out, the U.S. government said, boy, anybody who had been in Japan, anybody who had been going to school there, we can't trust them at all because they may be, their loyalty may rest with the emperor. Well, what happened when we got into the war, within a short period of time, the U.S. Army realized that we needed the language skills in the Pacific. And who are we going to find to train for these jobs? And not every Japanese American was fluent in reading and writing Japanese, but
many of them were eager to prove their loyalty to the United States. And as you said before, many of them enlisted, volunteered, or were drafted into the famous 442nd Regimental Combat Team, within which Senator Spark Matsunaga and Daniel Inouye served as officers. They fought in Europe, but your 6 characters in Bridge to the Sun were chosen and volunteered for this very different duty.
It was a different duty, and there were some people in the War Department who were worried. They said, it's one thing to send the Japanese American infantrymen to Europe to fight the Germans, but to the Pacific, would they fight their own kind? Well, of course they weren't their own kind. They were, our guys were Americans, and they were the Japanese army. But there was still that suspicion initially, but they again needed the language skills, and what happened was they brought them in, and some of the fellows volunteered out of the 442nd before they went overseas to go to the MIS, Military Intelligence Service language school at Camp Savage in Minnesota, and it was a 6-month program that was actually just cram-packed with all kinds of learning the military terms, learning how to handle interrogations of POWs. It was a tough program. And these guys, after 6 months, graduated and were assigned to 10 to 12 man intelligence teams, and were sent over into the Pacific. And they were attached to basically every size unit, from battalion, regiment, Army, Corps. MacArthur had about 400 of them down in Australia. And they were not only interrogating prisoners when they were captured, but also importantly, interpreting and translating documents that were being recovered off the battlefields. So it was a unique skill set. But at the same time, these guys were soldiers and they had guns. And they had to fight. They were in a war.
Let's refocus about that moment where your characters were recruited or volunteered out of the internment camps. How did they feel about that?
Could we show a picture? I'd like to answer that with this really stunning image taken in one of the internment camps. The Army recruiters actually came into the camps, and this is one camp in particular, and they were asking for these guys to volunteer for the Military Intelligence Service language school, and we need you. Now, these are some of the same guys who had gone to school in Japan who 4 months ago were said not to be trustworthy, but now the Army's coming in and saying, Uncle Sam needs you. And you could see they stepped forward. I mean, and they were given the oath right in the camp. And they were, motivated not only to get out of the camp, but to help get this war over with so their families could get out of the camps. And what an interesting side note is that some of these young men who were sworn in there in the camps were actually taken out by the Army at 4 a.m. out the back gate. So nobody else in the camp could see the recruitment, because there was some bitterness in the camp, as you know, as we knew. There were some bitter people there about, why are we here? So they were concerned initially, but these guys are certainly ready to go do their duty.
Well, tell me a little bit more about the specifics of their training before they were sent to the Pacific. What was that specialty MIS training? And
well, I mean, it's the list of courses would knock, as a university instructor, I'm sure would knock you back. It really looks like a college, 2 or 3, 4 years worth of college courses, reading and translation and Japanese, military terms, not only the Japanese Army, but the American Army, interrogation, interpretation, grammar, Chinese or Japanese and English, Japanese shorthand, Japanese geography, all of that kind of stuff. It was.
Were they trained in what's called Sosho, the calligraphy as well?
Yes, they were kanji too. So yeah, it was a tough program, and they weren't all, didn't all go into into that school fluent in Japanese. So they had different levels of fluency, and when they would form a 10 or 12 man team after graduation, they always made sure they had 4 or 5 very, very fluent in Japanese fellows, and then they had some others that maybe were better in English at writing reports and stuff like that. So they could, kind of pool their skill set and do their job out in the Pacific.
You mentioned they were also trained in interrogation techniques.
Yes, they were. Well, they had to know how to handle POWs, what you can say, what you can do with them, what you can't do with them, how to elicit information. And of course, there was the Geneva Convention. And one thing I was very impressed by is these guys were never, ever, I never attempted at all to treat prisoners badly. And in fact, they were taught that if you beat somebody to try to get information out of them, they'll tell you anything for you to stop beating them. So that's not the way to get, this so-called enhanced interrogation stuff that came up just a few years ago is pretty bogus, because that's no way to get good information. And these guys knew that.
How many exactly were in the MIS? How many say?
Well, there were about 35,000 Japanese Americans who served in World War II. About 20,000 of them went to Europe, and there were 6,000 who graduated from the language school, and about 4,000 served in the Pacific.
That's ironic. That's about the same number as were not interned, but imprisoned by the federal system under Department of Justice in the first roundup after Pearl Harbor, the fellows who were imprisoned in Santa Fe and Crystal City, Texas. They're basically community leaders. So it's very ironic that it was about the same number as the MIS.
Yes, that is. Can we see a few, Karen, can we see a few more of these pictures that I'd like to, I've got, stories here. Now this again is back in the school and in the classroom and at Camp Savage in Minnesota. And it was a tough course that these guys were basically in 7 days a week. The lights went out at 10 o'clock at night, and a lot of them went into the bathrooms where the only lights stayed on, and were studying in there for half the night just to get through this course. I think there's another. We can just keep moving through these. Yeah, here we are. You can see these guys, when they went out in the field, in addition to their guns and packs and everything else, had to bring these dictionaries and these order of battle books with them, and it was really something. But as you can see now, this is in Burma, and that's Frank Merle of Merle's Marauders. He had 12 the Nisei assigned to him, and these two were his personal interpreters. And you'll notice that, of course, they have guns. Again, they are soldiers, and they were there to fight as well as do the language stuff. And they also were considered very valuable among the GI units. There was some concern early on that they would be subject to some persecution when they went into the, went out to the Pacific, that some of these GIs, from Texas, places like that, have maybe never even seen Japanese Americans. How would they treat them? Well, very early on, they got the idea that these guys were going to be very valuable to them, and get information and not only help them win battles, but save American lives. Oh, now this is one of my favorite pictures. This is one of my characters, Kazu Komodo, who was shot in the knee in the Solomon Islands in July 43. It has a couple of distinctions. One is that he was the first Nisei wounded in World War II, because the 442nd hadn't even gone overseas yet. And secondly, as you can see, he's in an army hospital in Fiji, and this is none other than Eleanor Roosevelt doing a tour of the hospitals in the South Pacific. And she comes to his bedside to meet him, and she really visited virtually thousands of wounded soldiers on that tour. And you can see how delighted he is to see her. But a few seconds after this picture is taken, Komodo, who by all accounts is a pretty shy, guy, pretty soft spoken and whatnot, he decides this is an opportunity to tell the president's wife exactly how he feels. And he said, "Mrs. Roosevelt, I am out here getting shot, and my family is behind barbed wire in an internment camp in the desert in Arizona, and that's a raw deal. That's not fair." And she said, "Well, I just want you to know they're being well taken care of, and but I will pass your feelings on to the president." Of course, what she didn't tell Komodo was she had some serious reservations about the internment camp, and was wanting to see a lot of them get out of there as soon as they could get jobs. But in any case, he took his moment to let the president's wife know exactly how he felt. Now, this is Komodo again, about 2 months later. By now, he's already spent a month in a hospital in California and recovering from his wound. And he's discharged and allowed to go down to Arizona to visit his family. And en route, he takes the train, he takes a bus, he stops, gets off one town short of the internment camp. He's heard that they don't have a lot of fresh meat in the camp, so he's decided he's going to go shopping and bring some groceries into his family. So he walks into this little grocery and goes to the back where the butcher is, and he's looking. He says, "Yes, I'd like these cuts and this." And the butcher looks over at him and says, "We don't sell no meat to Japs." And Komodo says, "I'm not a Jap." And the butcher says, "Well, what are you?" And Komodo says, "I'm an American." And the butcher says, "Well, so am I." And Komodo says, "Yes, I'm in uniform. You're not." And as if the butcher saw him for the first time in uniform with his medals, with his ribbons, he said, "All right, what is it that you want?" So Komodo gets into camp, visits his family. And this is just a wonderful shot that really breaks my heart. It's his little brother on his lap, and Komodo is showing him his Purple Heart medal for being wounded.
There were many incidents like that.
Yeah.
And this one?
And this is on the left is Warren Higa. And he and his brother Takahiro were on the same language team. They're actually Okinawan, although they were born in Hawaii, and then their parents took them to Okinawa. Warren came back to Hawaii within a short period of time, but his brother stayed in Okinawa. I'll get to his brother's story in a minute, but this is Warren interrogating a Japanese prisoner on Okinawa. Now, these are the brothers. This is Warren on the left and Takahiro on the right. Takahiro stayed, as I say, in Okinawa, lived with his mother. She passed away, and then with other relatives, and didn't return to Hawaii until he was about 17 or 18. He finished high school in Hawaii. When the war broke out, the military intelligence service recruited Takahiro because not only did he speak Japanese, which of course is spoken in Okinawa, is the official language, but also the Okinawan dialect, which a lot of the locals spoke, particularly the older folks. And of course, he knew English, so he was brought into the language school. Takahiro was absolutely willing to do his duty, but there was one fear that he had, was that he never wanted to have to fight on Okinawa. He didn't want to have to look across the battle lines and see a relative, a cousin, a schoolmate, and that was a real big fear for him. He thought, well, the Pacific's a big battleground, so they'll obviously probably send me somewhere else. Well, of course, where did he end up? He ended up in the invasion of Okinawa, and more so when they were planning the invasion in the Philippines. His infantry division found out that he'd been raised in Okinawa, so they called him into the planning section, and they started showing him photo reconnaissance of the island, and they were, so they ended up using him that first day that he was there. They were saying, now we see these concrete pillboxes, machine guns, and we're going to have to take them out on the coast. And Takahiro looks at the photo and gets, a magnifying glass. He said, "Sir, those aren't machine guns. Those are family tombs, and I don't think you should blow them up." So he was really telling them what it was like on the ground there. And then, of course, in the invasion, he ended up on the beach and standing in front of the caves, one cave after another, with a bullhorn, trying to convince the civilians who had been really indoctrinated by the Japanese army that if you're captured by the Americans, you're going to be tortured to death, and it's horrible, and it's better you take your own life with your family. And a lot of them did. There were horrible scenes of young mothers jumping off cliffs, holding onto their babies. And so these intelligence, these language guys were just going from one cave to another to try to talk these folks out. And sometimes there'd be 100 or 200 of them in the cave. And if I can get to the end of the story, I love Takahiro is 50 years later, as a man in his 70s, returns to Okinawa. And the local newspaper does a story on him, and his picture's in the paper, and the reporter calls him up and says, "There's somebody that'd like to meet you." They arrange a meeting at a restaurant, and he's sitting there when this older lady walks in, and she recognizes him from the newspaper, and she comes over and introduces herself and says, Mr. Higa, I just want to thank you. I was a girl in the cave, and I remember what you said. You said, I am an Okinawan boy. I am in the American Army. We will feed you. We will take care of you. Come out to us. I am an Okinawan boy. And she remembered that, and that had been in the newspaper. So she was thanking him for her life, and she brought with her a younger adult woman who said, and Mr. Higa, I need to thank you as well, because you saved my mother. You also gave me my life. And so what Takahiro realized, and it was a beautiful coming full circle for him, he went to Okinawa. He didn't fire his gun once. He didn't take a life, but he saved a lot of lives. And he really felt that had been his mission in the war.
Was that the general experience of most of the MIS in the Pacific, fighting fighting the enemy from their ancestral homeland?
Well, there are several of the characters in the book that we follow. Take Roy Matsumoto. He was in Japan for about 4 or 5 years going to school, and then his parents moved from California to Japan. And so they resettled there with his younger brothers. And then when Roy came back to the United States before the war broke out, but his family stayed there. And so when Roy went in, and he ended up with Merle's Marauders as well. When he went in, he had this fear. He's got three brothers who were military age. And in fact, he wouldn't know this until the end of the war, but all three of them were in the Japanese army. And of course, that was his fear, that he would, in Burma on a mountaintop, have to look across the lines and see his brother. So, he took heart, though, in knowing that his family, at least he thought, were safe because they weren't living in Tokyo or, a place that would likely be bombed. They were in a small town called Hiroshima.
What about them being mistaken for the enemy? Did the American Army make any provisions for that?
That was a huge concern and a very real problem. Certainly the 442nd in Europe did not have that problem, right? But in the Pacific, the Japanese Americans couldn't help it. They had to face the enemy. There was nothing they could do about it. And so, the idea being, they could mistakenly be shot by friendly fire was very real. In fact, that did happen. And I talk about one incident in particular in the book. But in a lot of these invasions, they would assaults, they would assign a security guard to each Nisei, and just to make sure that he's not. I mean, can you imagine? War is dangerous enough being shot by, the enemy, but to potentially be shot by your own troops accidentally. At the same time, on Iwo Jima, one of my characters was, he was with the Marines, landed with the Marines. And about the same, here he is on the sands there doing his job, trying to interpret some battle plans that have been captured from the enemy. And this alert goes out to the Marines that the Japanese are stripping the uniforms off the dead Marines, putting them on and infiltrating our lines. So if you see a Japanese dressed like a Marine, shoot him. Well, there's our guy, on the beach doing his thing. So, I mean, it was just a terribly dangerous time, and how they must have felt. It just, there was really no safety anywhere.
Well, your book has tremendous amount of information, but what I took away was your great gift for storytelling. You get into the portrayal not only of the events and the training and the danger and the heroism, let's say, and the strategic importance of the roles of the men in the MIS, but you create a portrayal of their inner lives, which I've never really read in these kinds of books in the genre, let's say, of war histories. You go about capturing so much of the emotional tenor of their lives. You both of the MIS soldiers and their parents too in the internment camps. But you don't gild the lily, as it were. You don't philosophize. You don't add. You do it through pure storytelling. How did you accomplish all that?
Well, I guess I should first talk about what I look for in a story, and it's when it comes to writing history, I strive to tell a big story. And certainly this book is a big story. It's about World War II in the Pacific. And in fact, it even starts before the war in the 30s. But I tell it through the lives of a few who lived it. And that's what attracts me that's what attracted me to this story. I want to find out how they felt and how they lived and what their lives were like and what their concerns were about their families. And I don't want to just do, as I say, I'm not just looking for a military resume about where guys were. I want so much more. I should say that, the first work of military history I ever read, and I was in my teens, was a book by Cornelius Ryan, The Longest Day. And I don't know if you're familiar with that, but he had virtually a cast of hundreds, and he would maybe just have a paragraph about this corporal who jumped with 101st on D-Day, and then that's it. We don't, hear from him again. Now there's some value there for as a historian, and that was certainly remarkable work, and it probably kind of helped me figure out that, this is so interesting to me. But that is the antithesis of the kind of book that I want to write and what interests me the most. And it's very much the characters and who's in it. Now, you might wonder, how did I pick these six guys to have in my book? And it was a process that, first of all, I wanted coverage. In other words, I didn't want all of them in one place at the same time. And so I wanted somebody in ADAC, I wanted somebody in the Philippines, New Guinea, Burma, Okinawa, Iwo Jima. I wanted it spread out because I knew I was going to be taking on this Pacific theater. But also, I should say that only one of the six in the book was alive at the time I took it on. And I was able to have one interview with Kazuo Komodo shortly before he died. And it would not have been enough for me to have included him in the story, because by then he was 100 years old and, kind of losing his memory and stuff. But for him and for the others who were already gone, I had to find a body of material. And that also is part of the choice that I make, and also part of the elimination process. If I don't have that material to get into the interiority of the character, what they were thinking and feeling, because even though it reads like I hope it reads like a novel, it's nonfiction and it's all true and nothing gets made up. Dialogue doesn't get made up. It's narrative nonfiction, but it's nonfiction, first and foremost, true. So the oral histories and the interviews that they had done earlier in their lives, one organization, for example, Go for Broke, then you say, that's organization have been great, were great and have been great for a number of years, bringing these vets in and sitting them down and doing 2, 3, 4-hour oral histories. And there are other groups too that as well that have done that. Well, getting a hold of those. And then of course, not every oral history is equal because it depends on what they were asked. And, if somebody doesn't say, how did you feel? But just, says, well, where did you go? That's not, as interesting to me as the how did you feel question. So, and then it's part of like, what were the guys like? How did they answer the question? Were they willing to delve into their feelings? And not everybody is. And so that is the process of selecting as I call them, the cast for my books.
Well, it's a great, great read and very moving in the way you tell the stories. And, as the author of this very, very finely done book, did you have any takeaways from having covered this history and these individuals?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have to tell you, I was moved myself by the stories that I was constantly writing and delving into. I mean, it's true that even nonfiction writers cry sometimes when they're writing, not just poets. But partly, I feel my takeaway is that there's honestly never been a better time, I think, for this book and this type of book, telling these stories, to be published in this country than right now. And granted, I came upon it through, kind of accidentally. Again, wasn't looking for it, didn't even know it existed. But, here we are today, sadly. I mean, these anti-immigrant sentiments that are still just too prevalent in this country. And we're in an America today that too often prejudges people based on race, ethnicity, countries of origin. And, it's like, enough. I mean, this timeless message of courage, yes, but also what true patriotism is, really shouldn't be forgotten. And I'm really honored to have told these stories and to have, these guys came to life for me in doing the book. And
Well, they do reading the book as well. I have to tell you, it was one of the most compelling readings I've ever had of any book.
well, thank you, Garrett. And it was hard to let go, and I have to tell you, it still is a bit. And I stopped. It's been a long time since I've turned in the manuscript, but they're still with me. And
Well,
I hear from the families.
I have a number of questions that I want to put to you, but I think we reached the point where we have time for questions from our audience. I wonder if you've been fielding through those.
Great.
First question is, while you were researching your book, was there anything that you discovered that surprised you?
Well, I was surprised at any number of times. I mean, first of all, I was surprised at how many of these young men did step forward from behind barbed wire fences, and they were in camps where there were gun towers, and the machine guns weren't pointed outward; they were pointed inward. And these young men who were Americans, when they were asked and to volunteer, they did so in these huge numbers. And that surprised me and kind of amazed me. I mean, I knew obviously that the Nisei fought, in the war, but it amazed me to the extent that they did, and also their families. Again, their parents were Japanese. Japan was their country. And yet they were sending their sons off to fight against Japan, but they would send them off with this kind of message: Japan is our country. And by the way, the parents tended to be feel ashamed for what their country had done to this country. But they told their sons, and the message repeatedly over and over and over was, this is your country. America is your country. And go defend her and make us proud. And so many of these young men got sent off with that kind of message. That surprised me, that the families were so willing to give up their sons in that fight.
Do you know how many soldiers died while serving? Nisei soldiers died while serving in World War II.
Well, I know how many in the Pacific did, and I have actually a name. We have in the back of the book, and the JAVA organization, the Japanese American Veterans Association, helped me. I couldn't have done it on my own. Two researchers spent over a year going through all of the records of the graduates of the language school, and then looked at how many of them went to the Pacific. And so we have a list, and the Army had no roster. There was never a list, that the Army developed. And we have in the back of the book 33 pages of over 3,000 names of Japanese American soldiers who fought in the Pacific. And we also were able to find close to 60 of them who were killed in action. These language from these language teams and military intelligence teams.
We have another question here. How long did it take you to complete the research for this book?
Well, the journey I started on, it took me 4 years. And I would say about half of that was research and the other half was writing. And for me, actually, the writing is the hard part. I really love the research and finding out the information and calling and the families and trying to get what I could get in terms of any kind of records that they had left behind, correspondence. Again, most of them were deceased, but the families had retained, in some cases, some pretty extensive files and materials. And so they were, giving them to me and turning them over to me. And I just got so much cooperation from the families. They again we're proud of what these guys did.
Are there any TV shows or films that you feel are accurate or accurately portray the Japanese American soldiers experienced during World War II?
Well, there's none that have been done about the military intelligence service, the Nisei who fought in the Pacific. I hope this book will change that. And there is some talk in Hollywood right now, but talk in Hollywood is cheap. There have certainly been books and films done on the Nisei in Europe, and I remember it's an old one with Van Johnson was the
Go for broke.
That was it. Go for broke. Now I don't know how realistic that is because I didn't study that at all, but there have been a number of those. So and there's a new book out a year ago on the 442nd in Europe by a guy named Daniel Brown, which is excellent. He's a good writer. So if you're interested in the Europe part of the story, that would be a book.
These soldiers you covered, you weren't able to interview any of them except one personally. What would you have liked to ask them? Had you been able to do that?
Well, honestly, thankfully, due to the tremendous amount of great material that I had on all of them, almost universally for each of them, I felt like I got the answers, and I got the pieces of them that I needed for the book. And again, I thank other people and other groups for that who were able to talk to them and sit them down and oh, sure. I mean, would there have been a question or two? Obviously, I'm a former newspaper reporter. I would have had no problem asking them more questions, but I felt I got to the heart of the matter through the material that I accumulated.
No, I think so anyway. But now that your book is published and out there to be purchased, is there a story or a person you wish you could have included more about?
Well, I wish I could have had twice as many in the cast. And I actually, at one point, my final cut was 9. And then I looked at it and figured out how many pages that was going to be. And you know how publishers feel about pages. I was fighting a battle as it was to get 33 pages with the names in the back of the book. 9 probably would have been too many. And so I realized I had the last couple of people that I had really great material on, and I had to pull out and pull aside, and maybe I'll do another book. I don't know, but there's certainly more stories there, and certainly more. Yeah, I mean, it's there.
Well, we have a last question. Is it right to assume that the Japanese-American soldier experience was not covered widely by the United States press outlets?
That in terms of the Pacific, was that the question?
Well, it doesn't say Pacific or Europe, it just says Japanese-American soldiers.
Okay, that's a good question though, but let me break it up. First of all, the 442nd that fought in Europe got a lot of publicity even during the war, as well they should have. And they were a great example. They were to help with that helped with recruiting, other Japanese Americans and whatnot. And it was a they were looking for good stories, obviously during the war for the American public. The guys that went to the Pacific, virtually nothing was done. And there was a reason nothing was done. The war planners in Japan were pretty confident that their language was so difficult that the Westerners were just not going to be able to understand it and at the battlefield level or anywhere near there, and that a lot of the Japanese communications in the Pacific then was uncoded, and they just they were honestly sloppy and lazy about it and a little arrogant about it. We did not want them to know that we had these teams of Japanese language guys who were there. I mean, one of the characters taps into a enemy telephone line and sits there and gets the information and the coordinates on a big ammunition dump and calls it in. And the next morning, one plane circles over, drops one bomb, and blows this whole ammunition dump up. So that's the kind of valuable stuff that they were getting in the field that we couldn't have gotten if they were doing newspaper stories and magazine articles about these language teams during the war. So that was a really good reason why it wasn't done. After, when they were discharged, they were told, by the way, you were military intelligence, you're still covered under the Secrets Act, and you're not to go around and talk about what you did. At that time, we were doing the occupation of Japan, and we were trying to, build that democracy and ally, and we didn't really want a lot of information out there about, what we were doing. A lot of these guys, the language guys who fought in the Pacific did go to Japan and not only take part in the war crimes trials initially, but also in the occupational government there. And so they didn't even get the press after the war. And, and then the other thing is these guys, they're not the type that are going to go down to the Veterans Hall on Thursday, for a beer. Because there's still prejudice. I mean, they walk in, yeah, they're vets, but we just fought Japan, and that wouldn't have felt really comfortable, probably. So they tended not to join the typical veterans groups, and they didn't have big reunions because they had these small teams. So they didn't, So anyway, yeah, and the long and short of it is that the Nisei story in the Pacific did not get told and has not really been told up to now. So,
and many of us are very grateful that you tell the story. I know my friends Frank Abe and David Mura are very appreciative of the book, as am I. We've come near to our closing moments. My thanks and all of our thanks to you, Bruce Henderson, author of Bridge to the Sun, for joining us today. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Bruce's new book at your local bookstore. If you'd like to watch more programs or support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org/online. I'm Garrett Hongo. Well, thank you and take care.